All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to React Wednesdays. If you are new, React Wednesdays is a weekly stream we do where we bring in cool people from around the React world. We chat with them. We do fun things. With me, as always, Dan Wilson. Dan, how are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing good. I'm Dan Wilson, and I work with Digital Primates. We do Enterprise React stuff, and we curate the Enterprise React newsletter. So if that's your kind of thing, just Google it. We'll never sell your email.
And I'm TJ Van Tol. I work as a developer advocate at Progress. And before we get in and bring in our guests for this week, I want to remind you that, as always, if you want to keep track of what we're talking about on React Wednesdays, you can go to Telerik.com/React-Wednesdays. And I'll go ahead and drop that in the chat if you want to check this out. So next week, we're going to have Tanner Lindsley on to talk React Query. So that should be kind of fun. We just booked Brandon Bayer, hopefully I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, to talk about Blitz, which is a framework that builds on top of Next, which should be pretty exciting as well. And we have some people from Microsoft on to talk about building extensions for Teams, which apparently you can do with React, which is something that I didn't even know existed. I don't know about you, Dan.
Yeah, oddly enough, I just blogged today about an issue I had putting a React app in Teams. So it's a thing, and it works, and you can totally do it. It's pretty cool. In fact, I plan on trying to put Blitz in there as well, just trying to, get prepared. Yeah. So Blitz looks pretty cool. Teams looks pretty cool. Let's see if we can make them do cool things together.
You can throw React Query in there, get like a React Wednesdays trifecta going.
Trifecta.
Well, for this week, I want to go ahead and start to bring in our guests as we're talking about working in large React apps. So first of all, another member of our panel, returning champion to React Wednesdays, Mike Labriola. Mike, how are you doing today?
Okay, cool. I was reacting to the fact that you said you try to invite cool people, and I was wondering if that means I was
wasn't talking about back. You. I was talking about Paige for that, yeah.
I was hoping you were, because I was going to say the audience was going to be extremely disappointed.
You're just on the panel. Like, people don't really care about
You're
us.
You're right,
I'm game. I'm game. That works for me.
Do you want to tell people who you are for anybody new to the show here?
Yeah, so my name is Michael Labriola. I'm one of the principals at Digital Primates, but my deal is that I mentor and develop large enterprise apps in lots of different front-end technologies, but as of late, I've spent most of my time trying to bend React to my will.
Awesome. That's a good segue too. So large React apps. So our special guest for today to speak with us on large React apps is Paige Niedringhaus. And let me fix this. Paige, welcome to React Wednesdays. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on. Very excited to be here.
I'm excited too because people might not know this, but Paige and I are also co-hosts of a podcast called React Roundup. And the running joke on the show is I never know how to pronounce anybody's names, but I've had to say your name a few times, so I actually know how to do it. So that's kind of exciting.
It is, and it was kind of exciting that Dan was actually the one who reached out to me asking if I wanted to be on React Wednesdays, and it turns out that I already knew you, so it comes full circle.
Small world.
I sang the "It's a Small World" song as we did that.
Well, Paige, do you want to tell people who you are, what you do, all that good type of stuff?
Absolutely. So I am Paige Niedringhaus. I am a senior software engineer for the Home Depot, and currently I work on a large React application, an internal one, but I have been working there for about 4.5 years now, and have learned a little bit about what it takes to make large React applications that have longer life cycles. So I'm excited to talk about that today.
Are you by any chance responsible for the app that tells me what aisle and bay something is in? Because if you are, I'd like to send you a gift, a nice gift. That's great.
No, I am not. I wish that I was, but I totally agree with you. That is a very cool app, and the team that built it is doing some really cool stuff.
Nice.
Yeah, Bayfinder is one of our probably the most useful apps. I use it myself when I'm in the stores.
Well, Paige, I know we want to talk about some tips and tricks you have. Do you want to set the stage here for what you're going to be talking about, and maybe we could just start to dive right in, because I know there's a lot we want to get to.
Yeah, absolutely. When I started thinking about what I've learned about React and building really large, long-running applications for it, it's not that much different from probably some of the smaller applications that companies build that are not Home Depot in particular. But there are some things that you do need to keep in mind. And the first one is really that, is React really the right tool for the job if this is a brand new application? And if you would like to, can we switch over to start sharing my screen? Awesome.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, so the first question is, if you are building something brand new, is React really what you want to be using? React is not built for long-running processes. It's not built for extremely large data sets that you're going to be processing in the browser. It's not built for CPU or GPU intensive tasks. Those are really things that you'd like to offload to probably some microservices built in Java, built in Python, built in C# or .NET. So the biggest and first question should be, does React really suit what I'm trying to do? And I know that as JavaScript developers, a lot of times we're like, yes, everything can be solved with JavaScript. I can definitely do this, but is it really like the right thing for the job?
Yeah, and I think like last week too, we were chatting with Razvan, which hopefully I've got his name down, about enterprise React apps, and he brought up an interesting point too. It also kind of depends on your team composition, like what does your team have experience with? Because lots of times there's multiple ways you could solve a problem. There's different tools for it that they'll work, right? Like you could build this with React, you could build this with something like Angular, and if you have a team that has a lot of experience with a certain way of building things, maybe that's a better choice for you versus using React just because you think it's the coolest, hippest thing you should be using all of the time.
And that is a completely valid point. I actually read his article, and that is another thing that I wanted to talk about, is if your team already understands like how Java microservices are built and the kind of more opinionated structure that they will almost always take, then maybe, yeah, Angular would be an easier transition. Maybe TypeScript would be an easier transition. Maybe there's a lot of things that go into making for a smoother development process, and maybe React just is not exactly what you need. But if you do decide that React is the right thing, then you have to kind of ask yourself, well, which flavor of React would you like? Do you want the static site Gatsby React? Do you want the more dynamic with a router included Next.js? Or do you just want like straight up create React app? You can't see any of the configuration, you don't worry about it, and you just go to town however your team feels like it. So that's, I've kind of got this little thing of which flavor do you need? And it really comes down to how opinionated do you want your framework to be? How SEO friendly does it have to be? Do you want official support from the React team, which is only for Create React app at this point? And do you want a fully fledged framework, which includes servers, which includes server-side rendering, which includes SEO benefits, which, basically is ready to go straight out of the box? So that's kind of the next question.
Yeah, and it's funny because I feel like maybe, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, there really wasn't this decision to make, right? Because none of these options were even a thing. Like you had your like default Webpack config that you would use, and that was really it. So in a sense, like there's two ways of looking at it, because it's also kind of a good problem to have, because chances are, depending on what you're building, one of these might make your life quite a bit easier, but it also means there's more to sift and sort through because like I just thinking like, we have Brandon from Blitz coming on, right? So like you could create a column for that, right? And there's all sorts of other permutations within this. So it can be a bit much.
Mm-hmm. There's Preact, there's React Native. Yeah, there's more choices than I think anybody could really go through. These seem to be the main three that are leading the pack. But yeah, there's a million, slight variations on which flavor of React you want to use, and what it kind of comes down to, what does your team need? Like my team works for an internal application. So none of our users are outside of Home Depot. None of our users will ever access our application except from their corporate computers. So Create React app made great sense for us because we didn't need SEO. We didn't need server-side rendering. We did want to be able to take advantage of the latest and greatest from the React team as they continue to upgrade the system. But that was kind of the extent of it. So we just slapped an Express server on the back end and we were ready to go. But for other teams who are, customer facing, they will probably need the SEO benefits that Next would provide, or even the brochure type of blazing fast speeds that Gatsby would offer to you. So it's worth checking, and it's also worth talking to people around you who are working on other React projects. Another thing that we have is kind of roadmaps or frameworks that Home Depot recommends that we use. They are not hard and fast on like, you must choose Angular or you must use React, but it's like probably Java 12 would be a good Java to start with. Or if you're going to use Angular 4 and up. Just kind of recommendations like that to see if anybody has examples or good best practices to keep in mind. That'll help for sure.
How are those established at Home Depot, Paige? Like, so obviously that's a trick that I see with a lot of my clients, where once there's a recommendation list, one of two things happens. Either it's word of law and like, this is the recommendation list, and then unfortunately it doesn't get revisited. So I do have several clients out there with recommendations of at least Java 8. And so that's a very important thing that we cover. But like, is it developer fed? Like, is it people in the field and then reporting up? Is it kind of top down? Just it's mostly out of your own curiosity.
As far as I know, it's probably a collaboration of the two. I think that we have some of our distinguished engineers, our principal architects, get together probably on like an every 6 months or every year basis to kind of talk about what is coming out, what's available, what are teams currently using. So it seems to kind of be a general consensus, and there's probably a lot of outside research that's done. You know, ThoughtWorks is a great one for recommendations of frameworks and, you know, different levels of packages or things to include. So I think that it's more of kind of trying to keep a pulse on what is happening in development and also what is critical for Home Depot to be able to succeed in development. You know, because my team, when I originally started, we were building an Angular 1 application. And when Google decided to stop supporting Angular 1, it became a 6-month mad dash to decide what should we upgrade to, because long-term support is going to end soon.
That happens
so I
to
think
a few
it's
people.
Yeah, I think it's keeping a pulse on what is continuing to be supported long-term, and also what is coming out that seems to be better solutions than what we're currently using or recommending.
And just on that segue, if you don't mind, one last piece. Is there so that's the next trick, right? It's like when you have recommendations, then in big enterprises, we get lots of apps that were created last year and the year before. So is there a process by which those get revisited, or is it just that, is it only new development that picks up these sort of new recommendations?
It depends on how much new development is being done on those applications. There are some that are in maintenance mode, and probably they are not going to be revisited and rebuilt or migrated forward. But if it's something that is still a crucial system, or it needs to be supported for future use, there's no, timeline to sunset it, then it probably would be up for recommendation and for consideration of rebuilding it.
Yeah, cool. I always find it fascinating how different organizations manage, because it's a complex system, right? And there's so many moving pieces, and everyone manages it a little differently. So thanks for the insights on how it's managed there.
Yeah, absolutely. Always happy to talk about that. And that's actually a great segue, because maintaining consistent look and feel across many applications is really tough to do. So one thing that we've learned, even though we have what we call user experience enterprise, which is everything in Home Depot is kind of governed by this overarching enterprise UX group, there's still a great variance of looks and feels for applications. One thing that has helped us, though, is kind of deciding on a couple of core component libraries that we can all take advantage of and all know that these are the same pieces that all these different applications are using. Actually, Kendo UI is a great example of that. It's not the one that we ended up using. We're actually using Ant Design.
TJ's right there, and you had to say
I know, just twist the knife in.
Yes.
But that's something that has really helped us. And if you start to look at some of the applications that were built once ant design or material UI was decided upon, you'll notice that there is a whole lot more consistency in how applications look and then how they actually function. So that is, I think it's been a great time saver, a great development team time saver, design, just so many things.
Just thinking about the end user, you got some clerk on the floor trying to help a customer find something. And then there's this zoo of applications all with whatever the UI the developers felt like putting in that day. Sounds messy. So it's pleasing to see there's been some kind of standardization here, because it's super fun to reinvent UI unless you have to use it.
Well, and it's super fun to reinvent the UI, except when you have to start doing tables and trees and filters and really complicated designs to suit all that data that you're pulling in.
I'll say too, because sometimes people ask us, like, why does Kendo UI have like a button or an input? Because of course developers can build their own buttons. And the answer is, well, if you're using Kendo to build all your more complex stuff, well, then you want other components that just have the same look and feel and APIs and that sort of thing. But along those lines, I'm curious, when you use ant design, are you wrapping it at all? Do you have like a CSS file that everybody imports that puts like the Home Depot skin on ant design? Or like, how do you handle, like, because I have to imagine you have like certain customizations you want to make in a consistent way as well. I'm curious how you handle that.
We do. We have, so our project in particular uses SAS as our preprocessor. And what we do is actually have a base style sheet that has all of our Home Depot colors instead of the ant design colors. And we just override with that. And then everything else we pretty much use as is with whatever, requirements the UX designers have, because sometimes they want different padding or different margins or things like that. But for the most part, we try to stick to ant with as much out of the box functionality as we can, because it makes it easier for us as developers, and it makes it easier for our UX designers to know this is how this application or this particular component would look or feel based just on the documentation that's available. So we try to keep it as much to core ant as we can whenever possible.
Do you have a place where you document like your decisions around this? Is there like an internal like wiki, or like how do you try to keep people on the same page with these sorts of customizations?
That's a great question that I don't have the answer to. I know that our UX team has weekly design discussions where they will share, comps that they're working on with all the other UXers in the group and get feedback on it. And I hope that there is some place that they're keeping documentation of, the minor changes that they make. But honestly, you just get on the team from a developer standpoint and you learn what it looks like, and you try to just keep it consistent with that.
Yep, makes sense.
Yeah, I don't have a better.
But I think like it gets into like, there's a certain amount of messy reality you kind of have to accept in these, because everybody wants this like pristine vision where all of our apps are using all these consistent dependencies, and there's a very clear place you look for this to be documented, but you have to put that up against the reality of time and deadlines and humans and people leaving and coming into the company. And so really at least I always looked at it as like, you just make your best effort, right? You strive towards those sort of things, but you don't have to hold them up as like a end all be all. You must do these things sort of thing as well.
Yeah, and I mean, if you work for a company like we do, documentation is the last thing that ever gets updated. It's way less important than the actual application itself.
One day I want someone to tell me the reverse, that they start with documentation and they may or may not ship the actual app, but it hasn't happened so far.
Well, honestly, that's the interesting thing that you just said, is exactly that. In my experience, the companies that start with documentation, that is actually usually what ends up happening. And it's not that I don't think documentation is important. It totally is. But you're right. The hard part with documentation is that, just like an application, it's one more thing that needs to be maintained. And unfortunately, the reality of product development cycles is that it is the last thing that gets maintained. And especially when you have break fix sort of things, because when something breaks and someone fixes it, nobody is taking that ticket and going and updating docs. So even if you do have docs, they deviate over time from it. So yeah, I like it, but there is the counter example, which is the idea, and I've been on a team who really did believe that if we just document everything, then clearly like the code will just emerge from the documentation, and turns out it didn't. So that's how it goes.
I've also been on teams where self-documenting code was the style that was followed, and if you looked at the code, you had no idea what was being documented there.
I like
that's always the best, because whoever writes it knows how it's documented. Everyone else is cipher.
I like.
I definitely know how.
Doc-driven development. It's pretty good.
Anytime I write code, there are definitely several hours in which it is self-documenting to me. Before I go on to something else.
And 2 weeks later, you look back and have no idea what you were doing.
Absolutely.
Well, that's actually that's a good segue to the next slide, which is team plans. This can also go into documentation, but team agreements, as we refer to them within my teams, are pretty crucial. So things like project structure, things like what ECMAScript versions are you using? Are you going to try and use all ES6 and forward? Are you going to use, some older ES5 documentation? Are you just going to use jQuery? Things like this are good questions to try and answer, because it really helps with code consistency once you get into it. Go ahead.
Well, I'm just, nodding violently over here. That was a recurring theme kind of last week, is Razvan felt like there kind of wasn't a team agreement. It kept getting revised and people started doing whatever they wanted, and then the outcomes were unclear. And this slide is a key slide. In fact, a lot of your slides kind of focus on the human factor here, and I think that kind of gets lost as we rush to implement a technology that has to get filtered through humans, and they do strange things sometimes.
That's a great way to put it. I do have potentially a solution for the continuously updating team structure or team agreement, but we'll get to that in a little bit. But other things that you might consider is data handling. So next week, you said that you're having Tanner Lindsley on to talk about React Query. That's a great thing to ask about. It's like, how do we want to actually fetch data? Do we want to use just the fetch API? Do we want to use Axios? Do we want to use something as opinionated as React Query? Just trying to figure out how it makes sense for your team to structure that data fetching is probably going to make it a lot easier to kind of compartmentalize it and keep it clean and separate from, the components that are actually doing the rendering or the business logic that is handling that data once it comes back. Linters and code format standards, which I actually have some small examples of. So things like Prettier, things like ESLint, things to help you keep the code consistent regardless of who actually might be working on it. Other things are automated tests. Are you writing unit tests? Are you writing integration tests? Are we doing end-to-end tests? What does that look like? What are acceptable levels of code coverage? Our team aims for 80% or above on the entire application. So are you going to have things like gates like that set up? And what does that look like for you? And then the last thing is like automating whatever you can. GitHub pull requests are something that we require for every single feature that goes into our application. So we now have a template that is, what is the feature that this PR is attached to? What is the code coverage for it? Show me the build that it went through our Jenkins pipeline and successfully deployed. Just have all of those things kind of listed out, and then let the developers just fill in with the appropriate information so that they don't even have to really think about it. It's just there and ready for them. So
I'm curious.
Yeah.
Go on, TJ.
I was just going to ask, do you have things like either bots or humans that enforce some of these things?
That was my question. Yeah, I want to know who makes sure these agreements are followed correctly.
Paige, do you go and yell at people if they use tabs instead of spaces, sort of thing, or how would that process work?
I don't go and yell at people for tabs versus spaces, but I can show you some of the things that we end up using to try and at least keep our code more consistent. And it's things like ESLint and Prettier. So for ESLint, we tend to use Airbnb. They have the most strict and the most robust ESLint configurations that I've ever seen, actually. And there are things that I have turned off, like comma dangling, like indentations, no trailing spaces. Those are rules that I don't care to follow. But the team as a whole kind of comes up with these things, because sometimes we have, implicit returns, or we have just no prop spreading. Those are just kind of general things that we have decided as a team we're okay with. And the same for prettier. So tab width is always set to 2. There is no no fights about tabs versus spaces. Semicolons are always set to true so that they will auto format. Single quotes are set to true, trailing commas, stuff like that. So it really helps if you just have these files set up, so you don't even have to think about it as a developer. You just know that as soon as you save or you try to commit, it will just auto format, and it will alert you if there's things that it's upset about, and you can then choose to fix it or not. But in terms of like breaking the build or things about code coverage and stuff that's a little bit softer, we tend to use GitHub hooks. So our build pipeline is Jenkins, and it's pretty custom. And because of that, we have been able to set up our own rules that say if this build of all the unit tests do not pass when it builds, the pipeline will fail and it won't deploy. So that's a pretty good indication that you need to go back and fix your PR, and we're not going to merge that in until all of those unit tests are passing. So we take advantage of GitHub hooks. We take advantage of the fact that we can set up rules in our pipeline. And if stuff doesn't pass, it's not going to get merged or even pull request reviewed most of the time.
I like that a lot. That's like one of my things I always go to whenever I hear people talking about this is, to me, it's always easier if you have bots or robots or hooks that enforce these things, because no one wants Paige to have to come and yell at you for these problems, right? Like, don't want any resentment internally. But if it's just like some internal process, like something pops up like, hey, you can't even get this in if you do this, it makes life a lot easier.
Exactly. When Jenkins fails or Dependabot, throws an error, that's not me. That's just a rule that we set up as a team, and you have to go and grumble at them and fix it.
Yeah, it's not me. The ESLint quorum decided on this. So like, go yell at Airbnb. Yeah.
Exactly. So one of the questions that I know probably a lot of people deal with and have at enterprise is they need to migrate an existing application, which I touched on briefly because, like I said, our team started with AngularJS, and about 2 years into the project, long-term support for AngularJS went away, and we needed to either upgrade to Angular 2, Angular 4, or React. And it came down to being React, but these are some of the steps that we went through to figure out how to do it in a way that we could continue to develop new features for our application, as well as move over existing functionality into a new format. Because as much as the developers would have liked to just shut down, go for 5 months, rebuild everything in React, that was not a reality that our project managers were willing to accept.
It never is, but the developers, that's what they want. They just want to rebuild everything all the time.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
rebuild things that work.
I think it was Joel on software, and I could be misquoting him, I'm sorry, but it is a great quote, which is that it's because software is easier to write than it is to read. Because going back and trying to read some code that you wrote 2 years ago, and we ideally, right, like as a developer, our goal is to learn all the time, which means all the code I wrote last week should be less good than the code I wrote today. Mm-hmm. Which means that code I wrote a year ago should definitely be like really bad compared to what I did today. Because if it's still good, I'm probably not changing enough. So that means I'm going to always want to rewrite it if I got better. So yeah, it's hard to resist that urge, but I think it's not only natural, but maybe a good thing to have.
Well, in code I wrote in Angular a year and a half ago, I can't even understand because I have completely forgotten how Angular works since I've started working in React.
I think that's the one thing you can get developers to agree on. It's always that the previous developer was the worst, right?
Absolutely.
Like I know how to
even when it's me
way better. Yeah, exactly.
Don't run git lens or annotates on that. Yeah.
I like this. Jalen put this in here in the chat a bit ago. Yeah, who wrote this?
Yes.
Oh, dang, it was me. Yeah, like past self is such a jerk. Yeah, exactly.
That's so true. That's completely accurate. But
Right.
if you are in the situation where you cannot shut down building new features, but you also still need to migrate over, here are some examples or some tips that I have for going through it, because this is what we ended up doing. So we looked at our current AngularJS application and we tried to figure out what pages or views didn't really depend on internal state or even state that was coming from backend microservices. So these were static pages, like maybe a dashboard page, which just had, some cards on it, or a nav bar, a login modal, different things like that. And that's kind of how you can start making those small wins if you need to move to a new application. It's like, take the easiest things first, because that's also when your development team might be the least experienced with the new framework. So do the smaller, easier stuff to get your feet wet and kind of get your experience going. And then you can start moving into the more complex things, business logic and data fetching and handling large data sets, or connecting to outside APIs. And that's kind of the second bullet point, which is taking any business logic that you have existing in your old front end and seeing what you can move to potentially new backend services. Like, our Angular application made the mistake of thinking that it should do all sorts of data processing on the front end. And that was a nightmare when we finally needed to move away from Angular. So we ended up with, I think, 4 new microservices that were doing what the UI had originally been doing, on the back end, with databases and actual state management in a way that we could see it, which made debugging it a whole lot easier, I will say. And then we started moving the newly created functionality into the new application, so it would just hit those microservices, get the data that it needed, and be able to display it. So it's a long process, probably. It's going to be painful at times, more painful than others, but it worked, which is the main thing.
Well, I like it too, because you're thinking about it in terms of future flexibility too, because those services then, you might not have to migrate that same project again, but you might have some other app at the company that needs to do something like that, right? And then you have this ready to go, and it's not coupled to this random AngularJS app that's sitting around somewhere, right?
Yeah,
Exactly.
the chances that in 10 years Java is still going to work, but there'll be a new UI paradigm that people want to use. Or even, let's just say you wanted to roll this feature out to a smart speaker. If it's in a microservice, it's automatically available. If it's in some UI code somewhere, good luck. I once saw in some code somebody re-implemented the MD5 hash algorithm from scratch. No idea why they did that. I don't know if they were just bored and didn't have any work to do, but I thought, this is a one-liner of something that's already built in. Like, why are we doing this? So delete.
Yeah. Well, and that's the other beautiful thing about this, is that you can look at old features that the old application had, decide if they still need to be in the new application, and hopefully ruthlessly cut code out that you realize your users never cared about in the first place.
This one's always funny to me, because I've definitely worked on these sort of apps. Like, I swear these internal enterprise apps have this feature of just like aggregating features over time, because no one ever evaluates, hey, let's go through feature by feature and decide, like, what does this even do, right? Like, is there anybody at the company that even knows what this is? Because sometimes, like, those are hard questions. This is an app that's been around for a while. Lots of times you don't even know who's using this thing. That can also be a bit of a challenge too. So yeah. I kind of like this point of, like, this is a good chance to, like, just evaluate what are these things? What is this even doing?
Before we rewrote an app once, we actually first did a deploy where we added logging to the features to actually get a sense. Yeah,
that's really smart.
There was nobody at the company who knew all the features. So we logged it for a month to see who actually went into any features and what the reality was, because nobody knew. There was no institutional knowledge that kind of told us what the actual thing was. But yeah, it is a fun part of, as applications grow, And oftentimes you have half implementations, right? Something intended to reproduce or replace something else, and it never quite got done. So there's still one dangling feature on the old one that someone needs to use, but like 95% of it has been implemented over here. Those are some of my favorites too.
I worked on some code once, and the people that were architecting it had this code generator that would generate all the CRUD functionality. And so they would need one method, I don't know, like a list function, and they would generate all these methods and then check them in the code. And then the database would change, or the schema would change, or the business logic would change. And there'd be all this code in there that had it didn't work. It wasn't relevant. It was completely obsolete, but you couldn't remove it because something's going to break. And that to me was a big wake up call for the fact that code is kind of like duct tape getting rolled around on a dusty floor. Like once it goes in, it's really hard to separate it.
Well, one thing that our application, this may or may not be unique to our application, but our users all have different ways of doing the business that they have to do. So we have so many different ways for them to manage it. They probably don't even know all the ways that we've given them to handle what they need to get done. But we can't take out any of them because there is that one user who uses that one distinct way, which is probably importing an Excel spreadsheet, and we cannot take that away from them.
Yeah.
It runs the business.
They've been at the Home Depot for 22 years. They know this app really well. And God forbid you take that away from them.
Right.
We had a cute Mike quote in the chat. Maybe you want to bring that up. It's a nice little zinger.
Yeah, if I was going to go with one here, actually we use this one a lot when we're talking to clients, but there's it's a philosophical quote, but it's about Nurat's boat. And the idea of it was that you're sailing on the ocean and you have to fix your boat, but you're on the ocean. So you have to basically do it, one board at a time, right? So that is what enterprise software is to me, is how do we slowly replace one board at a time until we get a new ship, but never stop the old one from floating. Anyway, into more than that, but yes. And yes, Jalen, it is hard to unbake a cookie. It's
So kind of going along with that, once you have started building this new application, there is the ever evolving cycle that we've talked about, which is keeping up with JavaScript. So this is something that my team is doing currently, and we try to abide by it. We don't always, but when we started building our application, hooks didn't exist. It was React, 16.5 or 16.3 or something like that. So we started out with class-based components like every good developer did. A new component did mount like the inside of our, hand. And we added Redux because what good enterprise level application wouldn't have that for state management? And then hooks came along and Context API became a more viable option. And React testing library took over as way better than just an enzyme. So the approach that we have kind of tried to take is we are refactoring application as we go. So if we touch an older class-based component and it wouldn't take too much time, and this is really something that you need to talk to your product manager about, maybe a senior developer, maybe just look at where you might be in an iteration sprint. But if it wouldn't take too much extra time, refactor that bad boy. Hooks, I was not a huge fan of when I first started to learn them, and now I love them and would never go back to giant state components for anything.
Out of curiosity, what did you not like about them?
Just the complete mind shift that had to take place to understand how they were working. Like the dependencies that use effect can or cannot take in, the rules of hooks where unless you're making a custom hook, you can't call it except at the top level of a component. I don't think I still have ever used React use memo or React use reducer on a daily basis. I would still have to look up how to actually implement one of those. It was just a very different way of thinking about classes and components and how components get updated, I guess.
Do you possibly remember what slid into place that kind of turned your opinion to be pro hooks?
I think it was mostly just experience. That really, just doing something many times in many different instances where it needs to be done finally usually makes stuff click for me. And now I want to refactor everything that is a class-based component into a hooks component because it seems so much cleaner. And I feel like the state is closer to what hook actually, or sorry, not what hook, but what component actually needs it. Instead of having to be like at this giant parent level that just prop drills or uses context to pass stuff down and down and down.
Was migrating to hooks part of the developer agreement?
It wasn't part of the developer agreement per se. It was more like we have what we call tech tros once a month where developers will just bring up stuff they'd like to either see in the application or try, or they think it would be beneficial for the team to do this. And I think somebody brought up the fact that hooks were now a thing and we should probably start using them at least in our newer development. And people kind of just agreed to it and started trying it out.
Are you going to touch on that TechTro thing in a bit more in depth? Because I think that's interesting. The reason why I went down this kind of line of logic is hooks was a bit of a shift in how things, quote, should be, unquote, architected. And you had running code, you had some kind of working app not using that. And then somehow your team is now using it. And so there's this pre and post state, and there's a lot of stuff in the middle. And I think that process for a lot of teams or organizations or even people isn't well defined, and it's almost whatever happens happens. And I don't know if that leads to the best results. I was hoping you could kind of walk us through what worked for your group and maybe what people could learn from that, because there'll be something great we all should move to in a couple of weeks or a couple of months, and we're going to do this again, so we might as well get good at it.
Yeah, our application is not the code base is a little bit messy in that regard. We still do have class-based components. We still do have lifecycle methods. We still are using Redux periodically here and there. But, you know, my line of thinking is we chose Create React Apps so that we didn't have to worry about configurations. And it was, at least at the point where we chose it, it was backwards compatible. So every update that we made, and React 17 is a little bit of a breaking change, but every update that we made up until then, we would be able to take advantage of the newest and the latest and greatest with React, which is what I think most developers want, is to be able to use the cool new hotness. But we didn't need to migrate everything into hooks as soon as we upgraded. It was nice enough that we could use class-based components and it would still work, but in new pieces of functionality, new pages that we were building, we would be able to take advantage of hooks and start to really learn how to use them, get a feel for them, decide if we liked them or not. And I'm not sure exactly what the future holds for React, but I have a feeling that at some point, some version of React is going to stop supporting class-based components because they seem to be going all in on the hooks side of things. And at that point, you either will have to upgrade or you'll be stuck in an old version, unable to upgrade. So you probably better get on board at this point. They don't seem to be going away anytime soon.
Did I have a question come in from chat? Muri is curious, what type of project management process do you use? Like Agile, Scrum, Kanban? Is it Kanban? I never know how to pronounce that. Kanban?
We subscribe to an agile methodology. So we're doing a lot of what we call minimum viable products and kind of iterating and building features on top of them. But we do iterations. So we have 2-week sprints now where we will attempt to get however many features we feel like the team can complete in that time, done in that time, so that we have some kind of track record of how accurate the team is at pointing stories and then how good we are velocity-wise of getting those stories done. But mostly it's agile.
Do you build these sort of refactoring tasks into like your individual like sprints or those sorts of things at all?
It really depends on how big the refactoring might be. If it is a particular component that might be refactored, that probably is just kind of an implicit thing understood when you pick up the story. But if it is a larger overhaul, like upgrading our version of Ant, we did that 6 months or a year ago to get the Ant v4, I think, had just come out, or v3. That was its own story, because that there were breaking changes and there were multiple screens that needed to be checked to ensure that all the Ant components were working correctly and functioning as before. So that was its own story, actually.
Gotcha.
So one of the things that I did want to show, because we're talking about it, is refactoring. In my same little application that I was showing you earlier, I actually took a profile modal or profile page where a user can log in and they will see all of their user information: first name, last name, email, username, password. And I refactored that from using component did mount and class-based components to using hooks. And it took a little bit of doing, but I feel like there's a lot less code. Maybe not. Let's see. That's 236 lines. This one's 215. So really not that much. But in my opinion, I think that it's a little bit easier to read and understand what's going on. So you can see we've got this use effect, which is replacing a component did mount example. And it's doing exactly the same things. It's still getting a JWT token out of local storage. It is still checking the user info by hitting our database. It's still passing the same information. But to me, it just seems it seems to make a lot more sense that things like, is this component loading, or is there an error while checking the database, that those are separate now. This whole is loading, is error just set onto one giant state object, while it seemed like a good idea, and that was the class-based way of doing things, I think it makes a lot more sense to be able to break those out into separate pieces of state and then just have the user info be its own object with just user information based in it.
Yeah, we have some pro hooks comments in the chat too. AKD's saying use effect is hard to get one's head around, but it's quite an elegant replacement for class-based lifecycle hooks once you get it, which is sort of what you're saying, and I sort of agree with it as well. Like, a use effect is weird, I think, at first to most people, but it can be pretty elegant. And then G, oh man, help me with the name here, Dan.
It's pronounced Greg.
Greg. See, that's why I got to get these like mental like map usernames to like actual names in my head so I can do this a little faster. But yeah, love using use effect to replace component did mount and component did update. So definitely
we're
some
gonna get
pro hooks
Greg on the
people in
show
chat
one
too.
day. Then
Yeah.
you can meet him.
Yeah.
I
He's
agree
dying
with
to
both
come
of
on
those.
live code with you.
I'm just going to put a little asterisk on it, which is to say they are different things. I mean, like, yes, you can do a lot of the same things with them, but just for anybody who's new watching it, don't conclude that one is a replacement for the other. They do different things, but you can accomplish some of the same goals with them, which I think is everyone is saying, but sometimes that gets overlooked. I've read a lot of blogs that just tell you how to like move your component did mount to use effect. You're missing a little bit of the point if that's what you're doing. You're missing why hooks work differently. Anyway,
Yeah, it's not a
I'm just gonna throw
one-to-one.
that out there. No, it's just an asterisk on the end of that conversation. But let's keep going.
Well, and along the same lines, it's like I wrote this old test using Enzyme and Jest, which were, the prescribed testing libraries at the time. And honestly, it was a nightmare, mostly because I have completely forgotten how to use Enzyme, and none of it makes sense when I read the documentation for it anymore, because I use React testing library now, and it makes so much more sense. Kent C. Dodds, saying we need to test the way that a user would test in the browser makes infinitely more sense once you start to think about it than checking, did this Redux action fire off, and did this component implementation detail that nobody sees happen in the background. That just it's not a natural way to think about unit testing any longer. And so it took me a long time to get this thing working. And I still don't have the amount of coverage, if you look at it in the browser, that I do for my refactored profile test that's using React testing library and testing in, I think, a much more normal fashion. Like, it says it should render the user profile page when a user is successfully logged in. And then it does just that. It checks that the refactored profile is there. It checks that it can see the test information for the user. It tests that the buttons are visible. And here's what I'm actually talking about. Here's my little testing example. So if I log in, the one that you're actually seeing is the refactored user profile screen. But since I haven't completely rewired this thing, if I go to update user and then cancel my changes, it actually goes to the old user profile screen, but the data is exactly the same, which is what you want. You know, nothing has actually changed except the underlying implementation. So probably if I ran these tests that I wrote for the refactored profile test against the old profile test, they should pass, which is really what we care about.
I like AKDs. I see you discovered linear gradients. Your color schemes in the app is fantastic.
I did. I went crazy because it was just a learning application, and it was also built 2+ years ago. So yeah, my design skills were up there.
You've eclipsed me, I must say. But there is a site called Web Gradients where you can sort of copy one-line CSSs, and that alone has turned me into semi-competent as long as you don't ask me to do anything else.
AKD is also curious if you've used Cypress at all or checked that out.
Yes, I love Cypress. Cypress is what my team uses at work, and it is so much better than Puppeteer, which we started with. Puppeteer was a nightmare. Cypress, everything about it is more intuitive for writing end-to-end tests. We're big fans of it for sure.
And we have one more question from Rudik's World. Is curious what backend you used for this this little sample you put together.
It's actually just using an Express server. So when I was building this, I was trying to solidify my understanding of a full stack application with React as the front end, Express as the back end, a MySQL database. And then just to really be fancy, I used Docker and a Docker Compose to spin up every single piece of the application with one command line terminal. And so that's it. It's a standard Express application on the back end. That's all.
Nice. No, I like it. I need to go through this process myself because I'm like so front end focused that sometimes like I lose. Like I like to at least keep some bit of competency on the back end. And I know like today I couldn't throw this together, right? It would take me some time. So I kind of like this idea.
JS.
Well, now that there are things like Next.js, I think I might lean towards that first, since it is specifically made so that you have, your API folder and you can just handle all that routing without even having to do Express. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of a standard stack at this point. So it's nice to know that I could do it, even if I would have to go back and reacquaint myself with exactly how I did it then.
Yeah.
Since it's been a while.
Yeah, exactly. It's worth keeping these around it's amazing how often I just look like, how did I do this? And I like somehow in my brain know like, well, I coded it in this one app this one time, and I go back there to look how I did it. Totally.
So another thing that this kind of ties into everything that we've just been talking about is proof of concepts. So like we were just saying, our industry is very big on whatever is the hottest new thing, whether it's Blitz, whether it's React query, whatever, we're going to go for it and we're going to try it and we're going to shove it into our existing application because we know it'll be better. So before you do that, please vet it in a proof of concept. Make a smaller app. I don't care if it's like a piece of your existing app that you just branch off of and put X state into, but just don't shove it into the main master branch from the get-go. That's what makes me and other developers on my team really upset to see our package blocks change.
Rebase force push.
Yeah, I know. You never knew it wasn't there at that point. But really, proof of concepts are the smaller applications that you can say, hey, X state worked really well when I built this little application, or Ant design worked really well building these really large tables that we're going to need eventually in our own application. And it serves as a good form of proof for people like product managers who need to sell it up the chain that it's worth implementing whatever feature we're talking about, taking the time to put it in and use it and get the most out of it. It's great for making a case, and it's also great for other developers to be able to see how you did it. So if they're trying to use this new thing that you've, recommended, that they can actually figure out how to use it, because like we all have said before, documentation gets out of date immediately. So seeing a working application that is using it is usually an even better example, at least for me personally.
That seems fair.
Yep.
Yeah. Proof of concepts, they're good things. And then the last thing that we have wanted to talk about is tech-tros. So I don't know if this is specific to my team, to Home Depot, to Agile in general, but we like to do once a month tech-tros where all of our developers on our team come together and we talk about things that we would like to potentially update in the app or try out. Different frameworks, different packages, different end-to-end testing tools if we're unhappy with what we're currently using. And it's really kind of an open discussion where people can say, hey, I'd like to start using TypeScript in our application, and we can discuss the pros and cons of that. People can go out and do some more research if they want to get more versed in it and then come back and discuss it in a future tech-tro. But it's really just kind of a place to talk about new things or things that they'd like to see change.
I like
Has
this.
anybody else done this?
Yeah, I've worked for companies that do something kind of similar. Like we didn't call them tech-tros, but it was just like almost like an internal meetup sort of thing where different people could like present things on a rotating basis. And actually, this is one of those things that like to me loses some of its appeal in a virtual world, because like those were almost like little like team building things, at least the way we used to do them. And you could have a discussion that's a little bit harder to do just over a Zoom or a Teams call or something like that.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with you there. Our tech-tros tend to be a little bit more informal than that. Even people will just throw links into like a Google Doc of things that they think would be interesting to explore or discuss. But we also we try to have it once a week, and it's kind of a larger internal tech thing, but we call them tech talks. But it's the same idea where somebody will come up and they'll talk about Kubernetes, or they'll talk about some new logging and monitoring system that different teams within Home Depot are using, or they'll talk about getting started with React. I mean, it runs the gamut, but it's the same idea where somebody will just come and talk about something they've been working on, and hopefully other people will get some benefit out of it. But yeah, those are great.
Do you have someone at Home Depot that's like the czar of the tech-tros that like, because I think one of the hard things is getting people to volunteer to like do these and participate this? Like, because it's almost like, at least like I said, when I've been a part of these before, it was almost like a meetup. And so you have some of the same challenges meetups deal with, of finding people that are willing to like share their knowledge, right? Because people are busy, right? Like this takes away time from the production work they could be working on. So I'm curious if that's a struggle at all for you.
It definitely is. Once we went all virtual, which was March of last year, they kept them going for, I don't know, probably a couple of months, and then they kind of petered out because people weren't volunteering. And when you don't see somebody in the hall and say, hey, I know you're working on this, do you want to give a tech talk on it? It's a lot harder.
Yep.
One thing that we used as an incentive, though, was t-shirts. You get a free, customized,
awesome.
I gave a tech talk t-shirt.
T-shirt diplomacy. It rules
Exactly.
the world.
Yeah. And
You
then
know, in the
wear
wise
that.
words of Jerry Seinfeld, the number one fear is public speaking, and the number two fear is death, which means if you're at a funeral, you'd rather be in the box than up front giving the eulogy.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that rings very true, especially for technologists, because we're not public speakers by nature. So, yeah, getting people to talk about something that they've learned, even though they are definitely qualified to just by the fact that they have put together this talk, is tough. So yeah, that's definitely a thing. But in addition to that, kind of some other things that I would highly recommend are bringing in React experts. We're lucky enough that we actually have an internal team that does trainings all year long, and they will choose topics like React testing library, like React hooks, like advanced JavaScript. And we can actually sign up and send our developers to go do these 2-day, 3-day, 1-day even trainings. And then they come back with all sorts of new knowledge that they can use to benefit the team. But if you're at a company that doesn't have this kind of bandwidth or opportunity, just pay for it. Bring in people who really know what they're doing, because there are lots of them, and get them to train your team up, because it'll make such a difference in everybody. The development team will feel more confident. The product managers will feel more confident. The development team knows what it's doing, and most likely the product will only benefit from it. So I would say definitely consider it.
And while obviously I've got a stake in saying so I'm just going to throw it up front, but people are bad at math, right? And what I mean by that is that I've seen so many companies have developers struggle for 3 months because it's like, well, I don't want to put everybody in a room for a week and train them. And it's like, just take a moment here and go ahead and do that math on the whiteboard. And you will rarely find out that it is worthwhile to have somebody fight through a problem from 3-6 months and a whole team of people do it, versus saying, let's spend a week, even if you didn't want to bring somebody else in, even if you said, let's spend a week, we'll all go in a conference room and we're going to work through a strategy together, your team will probably learn more and accomplish more in that week than having them struggle independently for 3 months. But that math, I get why it's hard to do for people, and I know I'm not saying that negatively. I mean, I really do. It seems counterintuitive to say, let's stop work on these things and do something else. But to be honest, it's almost always the right answer.
Yeah, and I think the struggles happen in the dark, and so they're hidden from the people who would do something about it if they knew it was really happening.
Right. Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
And the thing that might click for one person might work for another if you were just sharing it instead of trying to figure it out on your own.
Yep.
And my favorite thing is I always laugh at like big companies that gawk at the price of things like training and stuff like that. And they don't stop to think the like time and money and the salaries they're paying and all those things. And it's funny that you have to sometimes get these expenses approved that are trivial in the grand scheme of things. But like, I feel like every company's got some sort of red tape in front of these things. And it just blows my mind.
Totally.
Yep. I'll leave it there for the moment.
Come on, Mike. Wish, say stuff. This is not being recorded.
No, I mean, it is hard, right? But it is probably the number one thing is that companies do spend money, and sometimes in really crazy ways. But the amount of time that I've seen people just languish, and to be honest, it's demoralizing and demotivating for employees as well. There are some people who enjoy just sitting there and working through a challenge, and that is the case. But a lot of people don't. A lot of people feel the pressure that they aren't turning in something, that they're letting their team down, that they don't understand how to get something done. And if they do turn something in, it's suboptimal. They may not be proud of it. And it's not that it resolves all those things, but the amount of time that it can take to redirect somebody in a positive way so that they can be productive. You know, if that person's going to be with your company a year, let's just say, and I know time, we're not in a world where everyone spends 20 years anywhere anymore, but let's say they're going to be a year or two. How many more hours are you going to get out of that are productive versus spending a week training somebody? Anyway, it's a big thing I've believed in for a long time, and we spend a ton of time training our people, probably like a crazy amount. But honestly, I would never change it because it makes such a big difference in what people can accomplish. Anyway, that's why I'm just shaking my head a little bit. It's one of those things. I'm agreeing with you, Dan, and I get it. I understand how companies do math too. I've seen it, but it just makes me sad. It makes me very, very sad as a person.
You know, .NET Craig has a really good point, and I think this is maybe a good place to kind of end on. It's sort of where we started, is alignment. You know, if you do a week training with the team, they all are going to start from a very similar place, rather than the sort of ad hoc training where some learn and some struggle and some learn the wrong way, and then you've got all those messes to deal with.
We also call it getting a shared vocabulary, right? Which is that if everybody, even if everyone doesn't get it, if you go through a training, a couple of keywords that people pull out, you can reference them with each other people begin to understand how to ask a question. So even if it's, I didn't completely understand this, but I know somebody explained this thing with kind of reducer patterns. Great. You've now created a common language that your developers and your team members can talk among themselves and ask questions with. And like all of those are like forward building progress that help things out. So if you can't tell, I'm a big fan of this sort of idea. But you know, just kind of future looking. And although Dan, I agree we are at time we can end, I still actually think Paige needs to come back and beat me up on my CSS and JavaScript comments at some time, because in the meeting before this, or like when we were kind of talking, she started, and I think she had some excellent points on that. So we need to make sure we have a chance to do that sometime.
Yeah, and while we're on the next page meeting, see that page? We just sort of got you for round 2. But there's a lot of questions around library choice and what you use for the front end and the back end, and that may be also an interesting discussion too. Pros and cons, different libraries, what you get, what the trade-offs are.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so many to choose from. It'd be hard to narrow it down enough.
Yeah, actually, Paige, we should ask you, is there anything that's important that, since we are at our time here, is there anything important that we didn't get to that you want to share or get across?
I think that we've actually really covered it well. The only thing that I can say that we didn't touch on too much is the documentation, the over communication. And this goes for within your team and then with other teams. Like, we have to work with a whole lot of other teams who own data that our application needs, and being able to have open lines of communication with them on how do I access your API endpoints, or how do I get even request access, because we have different request patterns depending on if you're in Google Cloud Platform or you're on Pivotal Cloud Foundry or Azure. Just being able to talk to them regularly and work with them is so crucial, because working in a silo almost never works out. So being able to contact them and look at their documentation and just ask them questions is highly beneficial, and will probably get you the answers that you need a lot quicker.
Well, cool. Well, this has been a lot of fun. I really enjoyed this. We will have to have you back sometime. But one thing we do like to end with is just, if people have other questions, we didn't get to every question that came in chat. Is there a good place for people to follow you, reach out, that sort of thing? Absolutely.
I'm on Twitter at pniedri, Pniedri. That was a terrible Twitter name, but I got it, 10, 15 years ago when Twitter first started, and I didn't know any better. So you can find me there. We'll drop it into the show notes as well. I also write on Medium pretty regularly, and I will have my own website, which is built with Gatsby, up and running in the next month or two. So you'll be able to find me there too.
But is it going to have web gradients? That's what people want to know.
It will have some web gradients. There's a pretty sweet subscribe button that when you hover over it, the background changes color in web gradients.
I'd expect nothing less.
It was fun.
Mike, do you have anything to plug at all?
No, I've got nothing to plug. Actually, I think this was awesome. We talked about some of the things that are near and dear to my heart, which is, maybe not just throwing people in the middle of something and hoping it all works out. So that's kind of cool. And I want to make one comment on your silos thing, which I thought was funny. Only I'm going to quote an old client of mine that said, "We don't just have silos here. We have armed fortifications that lob grenades at each other all day long." So if you can break down silos, in fact, I'll summarize, in my opinion, a lot of what Agile and a lot of what all these things are trying to accomplish is, it would be great if we all talk to each other. So I am in favor of communication, and in favor of not taking the hardest possible way to accomplish something. So in any case, I enjoyed your slides page, and it was a great talk. Thank you.
Thanks.
Reminds me, have you ever seen the comic that has like the org charts of popular tech companies? If you haven't, it's an old one, but I'll drop it in the chat here. But there's one, actually, I could share my screen, just because I think this is kind of cool.
Drum roll.
I've always thought, like, this, it reminds me of this one, right? The Microsoft one where you have the silos pointing at each other. I don't know. I always thought this was good. This is old, so it's like some of this has changed a little bit over time. Like the Oracle one is pretty good too, actually.
I don't think the Oracle one has changed over time.
Anyways, that's what it reminded with me with the silos.
Yep.
That's an oldie but a goodie. Dan, you got anything to plug to wrap us up with here?
Yeah, I'll mention the Enterprise React newsletter. Our development staff submits all the articles, so they're developer approved.
And I'll drop that in chat. And then the very last thing I'll note, I'm going to also drop in chat, once again, our homepage, telerik.com, React-Wednesdays. We've got some fancy add to calendar buttons. So if you want to make sure to not miss any shows with awesome people like Paige, click those buttons. What am I supposed to say? Like smash that like button, subscribe, like all those
fire
types of
emojis,
things.
Subscribe.
bell notifications to be notified of new videos.
All right, we'll wrap here. Paige, thanks again one last time. This was a lot of fun. I definitely enjoyed it. So we'll have to have you back here sometime.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. It was really fun to talk.
All right. See everybody. Until next week, next Wednesday. Have a good one.
Everyone.